Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacey, the director. For those of you who regularly attend programs, you're probably wondering where our student welcome is tonight. Well, because this program is the Student Advisory Board program that we feature every semester, all of the adults have been banned and the program is being completely run by the students. And they're going to do a great job. By the way, I understand that extends to our crack video team that is shooting the video tonight. It is all being done and driven by students. Thanks for coming out. 3 reminders that you usually hear from students, but I'll issue these reminders a little bit more sternly, perhaps. Turn off your cell phones right now, please. During Q&A, if you have a question, raise your hand. A student with a cordless mic, unless the director and the associate director are supposed to do the mics. Nobody told me. So I assume there are students doing the mic. They'll bring a mic by, and you can ask your question. Please ask one brief question. No filibustering allowed. If you have trouble hearing tonight, because we do have some problems at times with our sound system, please raise your hand, and someone will come by and talk to you, and we'll get the sound adjusted. I want to remind everyone of a program coming up 2 weeks from tonight, which is a Don't Miss program. It is on President Lincoln and the ratification of the 13th Constitutional Amendment. This book is essentially a major part of the basis for the very successful film released about a year ago called Lincoln. And it's a program that you will want to see. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the International Student Association, Global and International Studies Club, KU Model United Nations, Asian Student Union, and Asian Law Students Association, and we appreciate all of your co-sponsorship and your support tonight. Tonight is one of my favorite programs because I get to sit back and listen and enjoy. One of the things that I wanted to do when I arrived as director of the Dole Institute of Politics is to create a student culture here where we would encourage students to take an active role not only in their communities and in the national politics, but also in the running of the Dole Institute of Politics. We've created a student advisory board that's composed currently of probably 40 or 50 students who get the opportunity to meet our special guests at our program, to rub elbows with them, to attend the meals. It's a wonderful opportunity. And I know the gentleman who's running the program tonight, Quinn Reed, made his big debut as part of the Dole team when he got to introduce former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell 2 or 3 years ago in front of 300 people, and that's pretty heady stuff for a college sophomore, I think, who now, of course, is a senior. But they get opportunities like that, and we're very proud of creating that kind of a culture. And so that's why we do this one program every semester where the students run it, they pick the topic, they recruit the guests, they do all the work. And so we're very proud of them, and they've done a fabulous job tonight. Quinn Reed is our SAB coordinator for this year. He's been with us on the SAB for 3.5 years, I think. He has been working as part of our Dole Institute student worker force for 3 years as well. And this year, he has the big job coordinating the SAB. He's done a great job on this program, and it's one of the great things about the job that Barbara Ballard, our associate director, and I have is we get to see young men and women come into the Dole Institute as freshmen and sophomores and see them leave as very polished individuals. And Quinn is a great example of that. I'm going to turn it over to him. Please welcome the coordinator of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, Quinn Reed. Quinn?
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a privilege to be in this position, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out tonight to this program. I think you'll find it very interesting. Our guests tonight are Dr. John Kennedy and Dan Chen. Dr. Kennedy is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kansas and the director of the Center for Global and International Studies. He is currently the president of the Association of Chinese Political Studies. He has consistently returned to China to conduct research on rural politics since 1994. He is also the co-founder of the Northwest Socioeconomic Development Research Center at Northwest University in Xi'an. The NSDRC is funded by the Ford Foundation and conducts research in rural China examining topics such as local elections, education, and healthcare. He has published articles in the China Quarterly, Journal of Contemporary China, Asian Survey, the Journal of Chinese Political Science, Asian Politics and Policy, the Whitehead Journal of Diplomacy and International Relations and Political Studies. Please welcome Dr. John Kennedy. Our other guest tonight is Dan Chen, and she is a Ph.D. candidate in political science here at the University of Kansas. Her research interests include authoritarian duration, democratization, and comparative political communication. Based on fieldwork in North, Central, and South China, her dissertation examines news production processes and public opinion in China. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Marquette University and a bachelor's degree with honors from the University of International Relations in Beijing, China. She is also currently teaching a class on reform in contemporary China, and I'm a student in her class this semester. So please welcome Dan Chen. So I just want to get started. If we'll start with you, Professor Kennedy, and then move to you, Don. If you can tell me about your a little bit about your background and what sparked your interest in China.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Quinn, and I want to thank all the students in the student groups for this great opportunity. One of the best things about being at KU is working with students, and they're a great student body. My interest in China, that's pretty interesting. I've met people, other China scholars, and when they talk about their interests, they always start with, when I was 3, I started using chopsticks. And I didn't start learning Chinese till I was... Did you get that? Okay. How about if I do a little bit lower? Okay. Lower? I didn't start learning Chinese. So I didn't start learning Chinese till I was 30 years old. And so I started off as a really bad high school student. Not very good. But I was very good with my hands, and I love carpentry work. So I was a carpenter until I was about 28, and I started going to school at night, figuring that I wanted to do something different. And so I went to community college, Sacramento Community College. And at the community college, I wanted to transfer to University of California at Davis, but you had to have a foreign language. And in California, all the Spanish classes were full. So nobody was taking Chinese. I also had a very good friend who worked with me in the shop, who was from China. He actually escaped China after Tiananmen Square in 1989. And we talked about politics and my interest in politics. And he said, you gotta study China. This is fascinating. And I started really, I liked him, his family, and I started to get an interest in politics, and then I started getting an interest in China. So when I started taking a foreign language class, it was Chinese, and then I really started to get a love of the language. It killed me, it still kills me, but I love the language and the culture and the literature. And then I went to China for study abroad in 1994. On my last year, I basically graduated out of the program, and the moment I got off the plane, I knew this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. It sounds silly, but I loved it. And then trips to the villages. And after my first year, I got access to villages, which technically in China at the time was illegal for foreigners to go to villages. But I was able to get access, and I was able to live in villages in northern Shanxi, Yaodongs, and these really neat places in remote northwest China. And that also really got me the bug. I said, this is it. I really want to study Chinese rural and urban development. So then I applied for a PhD program and got in, and then went through the PhD program. When I was finished, I got to look for a job, and I was very lucky to get a great job here at KU.
And you, Don?
Yeah, so I grew up in China in East Coastal Province, Jiangsu. And when I was still in middle school in China, there was a very popular television news program. I noticed some of Chinese audiences here. So you probably know this. It's called Nanjing Linjuli, just in Nanjing. It is broadcast on provincial level television station. So I remember when I was still in middle school, that show became what everybody was talking about like overnight. So I was really interested in finding out, what captures people's attention. And one of the great characteristics of that show is it actually criticizes local officials and the governments. So that's one of the major reasons why it got so popular overnight. And then I went to college in Beijing for 4 years, where I was exposed to different groups of journalists. I attended meetings and salons and discussions with sort of the elite journalist circles. And so that's sort of got me further interested in Chinese media and politics. And then I went to Marquette University for my master's, and there I studied further on Chinese media and politics. And now when I'm writing my dissertation, I got great support from an advisor, and so I get to examine the issue of media and the politics in China. So.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
In 2004, I started a center, a research center called the Northwest Socioeconomic Development Center. And it was with my colleagues that I met during my study abroad in 1994. And we worked together and became friends, and he was going through a Ph.D. program in China as I was doing it in the US. And that group of friends, we created this center. Chandan was there.
Yeah, in the past summer.
I've had over half dozen KU students. They applied for Fulbright, and we hosted them there at the center. Any of you have an interest, feel free to contact me. But the point for this I'd like to make really quick is that those of you who are thinking about study abroad, think of it beyond the semester or year. Find people you have a natural connection with, people that you get along with, and make it go beyond that. My friends, my buddies in China, they don't speak a word of English, but we're great friends. We like the same bad jokes and the same bad beer. We just speak Chinese. In the summer, she was at the center,
Yeah.
and they loved her, by the way. They can't wait for her to go back. And every KU student that goes there, KU has a great reputation in Northwest China through the center. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'd like to start with a kind of a broad overview. We hear about the rapid growth in the economy in China, and yet the country is still run by the Chinese Communist Party. So can you talk about how Marxist-Leninist Maoist thought still influences China, and how that is beginning to open up in very broad strokes?
Want to start?
Sure. I think I can share some of my personal experience. So in terms of Marxist, Leninist, and Mao Zedong thought, it was a mandatory course when you go through junior middle school and high school in China. And it's also mandatory when you attend college in China, no matter what your major is. However, it is the course that essentially nobody likes, but they have to go to the class and pass exam because it's mandatory. And I think that tells a lot about how popular Marxism, Leninist thought, and Mao Zedong thought is in China, especially among young people right now. And so I think that also represents the general sense of the so-called bankrupt communist ideology in contemporary Chinese society right now.
Very excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I first went to China in 1994, I would go to elementary schools and go to smaller schools and high schools, and you would see pictures of Mao, Deng, Engels, Marx, Stalin, all up on the walls. And the mandatory college entrance exam in the 1990s, 1/5 of it was politics. You had to learn Marxist, Leninist thought to get into college. And now that's not, they've switched that now. That doesn't exist. They don't have the political aspect of that exam. It's been replaced with English, if that tells you anything. So the Marxist-Leninist ideology was extremely important in everyday life up until about 1997 and the late 1990s, when they basically started shutting down the national industries and in favor of making the economy more open, privatizing, and getting ready for their application for the World Trade Organization. So Marxist-Leninist thought is basically what it is, thought. It's not really a part of the economic system as it was in the past. And so now you have a Chinese Communist Party who calls themselves communist by name and has the rhetoric of Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist. But really it's more of a combination of state-owned and privatized and capitalism. So they have a saying called socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is basically capitalism. And so the Marxist-Leninist thought the change over time has been more in practice, but the rhetoric still continues. Mao Zedong is still very important. His image is still right up there in Tiananmen Square. You've had a popularized Mao Zedong for a while. You see little pictures of Mao on the taxi.
Yeah.
And I would say, why is he up there? Is this for ideology, political? He said, no, good luck. I've visited several Mao Zedong temples, which there's only 3 in the country in Northwest. People go there to pray for their 3 reasons. One is for the kids to do well in the high school exam. The other is old cadres go there to pray, and then women go there so they can get boys for pregnancy. So you see these kind of images of Mao still coming up. Images of Mao are still prevalent. But the influence of Mao Zedong thought has changed. What has replaced it, mostly, is the current leaders. So in the 1990s, it was Jiang Zemin's 3 represents. And they had study sessions, and they had to do it, Sangha Daibiao. And then you had Hu Jintao's Harmonious Society. And now that's part of it, He Xie Shuhui, right? And that's all part of it. And now we're waiting for Xi Jinping's, what is his ideology going to be? We don't know yet.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned a couple times about the college entrance exam. So I think that's a good segue to my next question. Can you talk a little bit about the education system, maybe touch on some of the rural-urban divide and the shadow education system, and then how that culminates in the college entrance exam for students?
Sure. Want me to start this?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the rural and urban divide in education is something I actually do my research on. I've worked with my Chinese colleagues on this in great depth. In China, they talk about the rural and urban divide in income. So if you were to see a graph, you would see that by 1980, the rural and urban divide was very little. There was a very little gap between rural and urban. They were all poor. Nobody had anything, so it was fine. There was no gap. As you go up and the reforms occur, rural incomes increase, but the gap between rural and urban just dramatically increases. Income is not the main issue. The gap is really in healthcare and in education. Education's the key. Without a good educational background and without investment in education, there's no way people are going to get out of poverty, and particularly in China. So, and the biggest gap was this rural and urban gap in education. And the rural folks, for many years, in the 1980s, 1990s, they had to pay fees, tuition, to go to school. And the tuition costs were huge compared, as a proportion of your income, for rural folks than for urban. And then on top of that, mandatory education, compulsory education, is only to the 9th grade. So in a village, you're in a village elementary school. But then when you go to junior high school, that villager has to pay not only tuition, but room and board. Going to high school, it's the same thing. So the proportion of your education costs for the rural family as opposed to the urban family was higher. So not only was their income lower, their relative education costs were higher. This is something that has made it tremendously difficult. And then getting into college, this has an influence for college. College entrance exam in China, it happens once for about 3 days. It used to be in July. And it was 3 days where the country shut down. You would go down and you go down streets and they would block off the streets. No horns, no cars, in order to make sure that it's quiet for the exam. If you don't take that exam well and you don't do well, you don't go to college. And your score determines what level of college you go to and where you go to. And so when somebody did a study about 4 years ago, and they looked at the proportion of rural people in four-year universities. 1 out of 35 were from the countryside. 4 years ago, you had over 50% of the population from the countryside. So that gap has continued, and it's really been very hard on villagers. And only recently have they gotten rid of tuition. It's free. However, there's also hidden fees, of course. And there's also rural to urban migration. So now you have people with rural incomes making higher incomes, but when they go to the cities, it's very hard to get into those urban elementary schools. So now you've got a new gap of this massive rural to urban migration and education problems there. But as far as what it takes to get into the exam, I'll let Chandan pick up on that. But one final note on the family planning. Family planning in urban China, since 1980, everybody has basically one child. You combine one child with this pressure to go to school, you have this tremendous pressure on individual kids. So Chinese high school students have no life. And they have this, urban at least. And there's pressure to really do well. And so that combination of family planning and that exam has really put a lot on children. And I think one of them should give you some of their.
Yeah, actually, I'm the only child in my family. I'm the first generation after one-child policy was implemented. And I can speak to that. Really, Chinese high school students, they don't have a life. And I remember when I was in Chinese high school, this is my daily schedule. So we have class from 7:30 in the morning, and the class runs all the way till about 6 p.m. in the evening. And then we have a short, sort of an hour and a half break for dinner. And then after that, we will have study sessions. And you have to go to school again and do your homework there. And that study session runs till 10 p.m. at night. And then that's when we go to school. And so that would continue from Monday, not to Friday, but to Saturday. And we don't have Sunday off. We actually only have Sunday afternoon off because we still have class in Sunday morning. And so every week we only have an afternoon off. And so that's pretty much the 3 years of high school. So as you can imagine, we really didn't have time to have a life when you're in high school in China. And also the National College Entrance Exam is pretty much what every Chinese student has been living for during the first 12 years from elementary school all the way till high school, because that number, the score you get on the exam, basically decides, as Professor Kennedy just said, which school you can go to, and that pretty much decides your job aspects and which city you're going to be able to live in. And so that's very important for Chinese students, especially for students who come from an underprivileged family background. So your education is pretty much the only way that you can use to move up the social mobility ladder. And so that is very important. And combining with the family planning and the one-child policy, the only child sort of have to shoulder all the hope from your family to move up to get into a good university and a good job. And so actually the psychological burden on Chinese high school students is a very serious social issue. And there have been several suicides happening every year because students are under tremendous pressure to get a good score. And so that's the reality of this system.
I'd like to, they moved it from July to the first week in June.
Right.
Because students were passing out because of the heat, waiting for the exam. And before the exam, and I've noticed this for the last 3 years, because I'm usually there in the summer, is they have public announcements on TV. This is your child. You love your child. It doesn't matter if they get in or do well in the exam. You shouldn't put the pressure. They are really great because in response to the higher suicide rate. So these public announcements are saying, look, it's better to have a kid not in college than to lose them because they've done it. And it's very serious. And when you see them put an announcement on this, you know it's serious. I mean, in China, there's a running joke as far as it comes to media and stuff. Don't believe anything until the government denies it. So it's, you know, by saying, oh, it's suicide rate's low, it's okay, but really, they have these public announcements saying this is a serious, real issue, and take care of it. And then the last point, you talk about shadow education.
Right.
Shadow education is the money spent beyond tuition to help your child. Shadow education costs are extremely high in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, in these cities, where people spend a tremendous amount of money on tutoring. English tutors, music tutors, math tutors, doing practice test exams. So everything that Chandan was talking about was as far as the things you do officially. There's unofficial shadow education where the expenses are so high, rural folks cannot compete. I mean, cities, urban folks can't compete. Shanghai had one of the best high school exam tests. Internationally, it ranked around number 5 or so. And everybody thought, look at the Chinese system. And it didn't reflect the Chinese system. It was a huge uproar within China. It says what this reflects is a shadow education system and the unequal, unfair advantage that certain people have in order to improve their chances for the exam, as opposed, and it's based on finances and not, where you're born and how much money your family has, not the institutional mechanisms to help you do that.
And I think for many of the urban parents, they weren't even sure like which class to send their kids to, whether it's piano class or painting class or calligraphy class. And so those urban parents actually form a great market for those training agencies to grab. So they have this really aggressive advertisements targeting urban parents, to show what kind of class they can have and to help their children move forward. So that's another part of the shadow education.
When I was in China in 2010 with the family, I was there on a faculty Fulbright. My daughter was in kindergarten. She went to a public kindergarten. She come home and she says, there's nobody to play with. All my friends in kindergarten, they're already got the English tutors, the math tutors, and there was nobody was out to play. And we'd meet the parents and they'd say, so what music instrument is your daughter playing? And who's her math tutor? And I said, we don't have all that stuff. And he said, what kind of parent are you? Don't you think she's going to get into a good elementary school? So that's reflect part of that.
I know another place that we see that divide in China, not only in the urban and rural sense, but also between age groups, is in usage of the internet. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that digital divide with internet access in China.
I guess one example is if you go to China and if you go to one of those public internet cafes where you have access to computers and also the internet, what you will see is actually, again, 18 to 25, or probably younger than 18, male students, young people. And what they're doing is they're actually playing video games or chatting online. And so oftentimes when we talk about the internet in China, we're often referring to the political nature of the internet in China. But in fact, the majority of the internet users in China, they use the internet for shopping, for chatting, to communicating with their friends and families, or playing video games. The number of them who use the internet for political purposes is actually very low compared to the majority of this group of people.
Yeah, there's internet bloggers, and they basically make up, or they netizens, and they get a lot of attention in the United States, especially the ones that are in English, right? Yeah. But for Chinese, most of these kind of discussions on the internet are basically not geared towards the central leadership. They're usually the central leadership actually allows a lot of this as letting off steam. So some of the discussions and complaints are usually against local government officials. So we see that in the use of the internet for complaints and movements against local officials. But the digital divide you're talking about is actually between rural and urban and urban and rural. So you have these, there's 250 million to 300 million estimated rural to urban migrants. And when migrants move to the urban areas, they're usually in something called what they call an urban village, 城中村, or they're in these, they live literally on the construction sites. So having the type of access to the internet like we see, or we have, is pretty limited. And so that's a big case. The countryside is getting more. You can't say the countryside doesn't have internet. It depends on your distance to the urban centers. Some have them, you get further out, you get less. So it's the access to the internet is getting greater, and people are having more and greater access to it. But the American misconception is that access means you immediately go to the New York Times, or you're going to immediately look at what's going on outside the world, when basically it's like the US. I mean, people are interested in what's going on locally, they're interested with their friends, and using it in different ways. So that digital divide, I would say, number one, rural and urban is still stark, but urban and urban is also pretty stark. And the usage of it is becoming a greater percentage of people are using it. I think we probably jumped ahead on a question talking about how they use it.
Well, and I guess even you talk about like that divide exists, but there's still, like we see networking sites like Sina Weibo that have over 500 million registered users and have over 100 million posts that are posted on it every day. So can you talk about effects that those networking sites are having on like the way potential democratization effects that those kind of sites might have?
I think Sina Weibo's site does facilitate the speed of the spread of the information. And I remember during my fieldwork in China in the past summer, one of my journalist friends, he is really active in using social media to sort of organize events or sometimes organize demonstrations. And his technique to get around the censors on the internet is he would have several friends and they would announce a certain event, but they would sort of talk to each other and make sure that, okay, it's 8 p.m. and we will send out the message sharp at 8 p.m. so that the censors would not have enough time to censor all the social media posts. And although eventually those posts will get censored, but still during that very short time window, they were able to get more people to get to read their posts. And so that's one of their techniques. So I think in that sense, the nature of technology here really facilitates the spread of the information, although that function is still very limited.
Well, first of all, we look at the numbers, 100 million, 500 million, we say that's a lot. And then China numbers, not that much, maybe about 5, 6 cities, right? So but the interesting aspect about this is that notion of democratization. That's using a Western perspective of we think they're using it, and the internet is going to be this way of giving everybody a voice, and the voice is not going to be supportive of the government. There's going to be kind of a pushback. But actually, the government uses the internet very effectively. And it comes, for example, on Weibo and stuff, there are also ways of diffusing certain types of movements through, the government would do that through their own posts on Weibo or their own kind of internet stuff. So to think the internet is this democratizing effect may give the internet too much more of a power or assumption of that than it really does. Because we do see that. I was in China in 2010 and I was working in our center, and all of our center are all graduate students. It was a massive, one of the largest anti-Japanese protests that occurred when I was there in October at that time. And 3 days before, they were using the internet and texting and collaborating and working together for this giant anti-Japanese protest. And the government was very allowing it and let it happen, and it did happen. And it was massive, and then afterwards, the government shut down the universities. They put everybody in the university was not allowed to go in or out of that universities all throughout Xi'an for 3 days, and the internet was shut down. So the government allowed them to use the internet to organize and then shut it down and then open it up again. So when we think about it, the internet, I think there's many more uses for it than just democratization, and that the regimes we look at thinking the internet's going to push back are very astute, not just on censoring, but how to use the information within it to promote policies, promote a lot of their own ideology, and promote and actually do counter protests through the internet.
Yeah, actually adding to that point, when we talk about the internet, we often thought about the populist nature. It's the people, the citizens who are using the internet. But in fact, the government is also hiring actually a group of people that they call internet commentators to very actively post comments online that are very sort of positive to the government. And they were called the 50-cent party, because if they post one positive comment on the internet, they will get 50 cents in return.
Oh, I thought it was a rapper.
Right. So that's 50-cent party in China.
Okay.
So, and in fact, this has actually become a profession right now, and they are going through this professionalization process. The Ministry of Culture, they actually issue certificate to what they call actually online public opinion analysts. And these are the people who monitor online public opinion and try to publish positive posts in accordance to current online public opinion. And so this has become a enlarging group of people in China right now that the government actually is actively promoting its own ideology and positions on certain issues. So we have to look at both sides of the issue. Both the citizens and the government is actually actively using the internet.
And again, I think we'll play off this again. It's a very good point, is the notion of we do see posts, and there are many posts, and there's a lot of good studies on this, on actually criticism of, just like the criticism show we were talking about before, criticizing local government officials. And that we see a huge increase in these criticisms of local officials criticizing corruption, criticizing the type of behavior that they see in Chinese Communist parties at the local level, and they aren't censored. They keep going. And people might say, oh, that's slipping through the cracks. But non-action is also an action. The central government allows a lot of this in order to release steam, to say it's okay. But as soon as those posts go towards criticizing above the provincial and go towards the central leadership, those posts disappear. So there's this allowance of movement, which we have to keep into mind. Compared to 10 years ago, it's pretty remarkable. When I look at China, I don't compare China to the US and now. I compare Chinese reforms and openings as now as opposed to 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And we can see, even though we're being relatively critical, we do see a trajectory of this openness, much more so than before.
Another place where we might see a change in this openness, and we likely have government censorship through action and also non-action, is in the media. So I was wondering if you can talk about the government's and the government's involvement in the reforms that have happened in television and newspapers.
So I think a recent study actually published by a political scientist at Harvard and his collaborators examines social media in China, and he finds that, as Professor Kenny said, criticism actually exists in Chinese cyberspace, and those posts are not more likely to be censored than any other posts. The ones that are more likely to be censored are the ones that ask for collective action, such as protests or demonstrations. Those are the ones that will be censored by the government. And so that's a very interesting finding, that the government is actually actively using the media to, as Professor Kenny just said, let some of the steam out. And so I think in terms of the media, the government really is actually using some of the PR techniques to actively promote a positive image of both the leader and the party and the government in China. So I think that's a major, sort of a new trend in Chinese media right now.
And I guess getting at, you were also mentioning the television, music, and movies. Since 1994, I've seen a remarkable change. For example, and I'd also include books and types of entertainment. So when I first went to China in 1994, it was extremely difficult you'd have to go to a big theater to get see a good movie from outside, American movie, even Chinese movies. You wanted to get magazines, they were relatively limited. If you wanted to get some good newspapers, you go to the bookstore, and the bookstores are relatively small. And if you found one good book in Chinese that you like, and I wanted to share it with a friend, I'd never find it again. So it was kind of different, and it was more limited in your choices and what was available. Now, by 2004, 10 years later, it was a much bigger difference, much more availability of magazines, newspapers, television programs had really developed. And then you see movies everywhere. International, not just American, European, French, Chinese movies became much more of a bigger business. And then by now, let's say last time I was in China, you do see this television films and movies. There's just such a choice. The bookstores, you go into a bookstore in China and it is packed with people. No place to sit down. Everybody's there, they're reading, they're looking at books. Two reasons for that. One, the choices that you have now are much greater than you ever had before. And you can get anything from the American Constitution to human rights, UN Human Rights Report, The Coming Collapse of China, translated into Chinese. You can get all kinds of books and articles in there. But the other reason is Chinese public libraries aren't as good as the new bookstores, so people kind of use them a lot that way. I remember I gave a talk a few years ago, and it was about 4 years ago, and an elderly couple came up to me and they said, we used to smuggle Bibles into China in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and there was a huge demand. Now nobody wants our Bibles. We can't smuggle them into China anymore. What happened? I said, you can buy them in any bookstore. A fully abridged Bible, Quran, you can get it. So there's no need to smuggle them like there was before. The television is really fascinating.
Yeah.
You'd see television programs on the news end, which is Chandan's expertise, but then my expertise, which would be reality TV. So you have Chinese reality TV, Chinese dating shows, the music shows, everything from just complete American Idol knockoffs, dating show knockoffs, 1960s American dating shows knockoffs. You see, and it's pretty fascinating how they go through. And then the Chinese media censorship kind of goes up and down, or what I would say more like a rubber band. If it gets too much to a point, they did start closing down some of the dating shows and reality shows because they said they were getting too racy, and there was problems with that. And then so they shrunk it down. Then they started coming back again, and you had different types of shows. American music, Chinese music, Chinese popular music has a lot of copies of American music, from heavy metal bands to popular music. You know, I'd asked average Chinese college students, you know, on their favorite thing, that's where the 50 Cent come in, right? And that was a different 50 Cent. And they knew more about American pop music than I did. I had no sense. And then Chinese hip hop, you can see Chinese hip hop everywhere. And you know, it's strange seeing a white guy in Kansas in hip hop uniform. You should see it in Beijing and Xi'an. And it's very, you know, very real. So you get this, the media has become more open. I would say international. I'd like to say global, but in reality, we're looking kind of Americanization in a sense. But the real key here is it's become much more open in the last 10 years than we've seen after. And a good benchmark there was after the Olympics. We saw a tremendous amount of that openness in the Olympics. And a newspaper, and when you look into a newsstand, there's just a huge array that you can get. Now, like America, half of them or more than half are going to be like Chinese equivalent of People magazine and Esquire and whatever those other type of things you see in the supermarkets. But the other half are going to be some very serious news. Nanfang Zhoumo, the Southern Weekend newspaper, is like the Economist or Time magazine of China. It is one of the best. It comes out every Thursday, and everybody really wants it. It sells out quickly, and it's a fantastic paper that gives tremendous insight. You know it's a good paper because they sack their editor about once a year. So, but that's, I think, getting at some of that.
And also that's the paper where President Obama gave a one-on-one interview with during his visit in China in 2009. Although the full transcript did not get published, of course that's going to be edited and truncated, but that's the paper that President Obama selected. Also adding up to the television news shows this Americanization or globalization part of American Chinese entertainment television shows. So there is a popular reality show in America called The Voice, and there is The Voice of China. So Chinese producers bought the copyright of The Voice, aired on NBC, and they produced an basically exact same show in China with Chinese musicians acting as coaches. So they have Voice of China. Also for American Idol, they have Chinese Idol that just launched last year actually. So they also bought the copyright of American Idol, and they picked 4 Chinese musicians acting as judges. And these 2 shows are hugely popular among the Chinese audiences. So that's another aspect of Americanization of Chinese television shows.
Including Breaking Bad, which is really big.
Right. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. But you mentioned briefly the Beijing Olympics, and I know when I told some of my friends that I was doing this program, they all like instantly talked about Beijing, and that was their perception of China. So can you talk about what the Beijing Olympics meant for China and some of the issues that were surrounded the Olympics?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Well, I was in Xi'an, in my Chinese hometown, and hanging out with my friends, and there was the announcement 4 years earlier that Beijing was going to get the Olympics. And at that time, China had this massive movement called Opening of the West, Shibuda Kaifa. This Opening of the West meant they said they were going to invest heavily in bridging that coastal interior poverty gap. And after they announced the Olympics, I asked my Chinese friends, I said, hey, isn't this great? China's got this international face, what do you think? They said, I think the opening of the West is going to wait another 10 years because they're going to invest heavily in Beijing. And that's basically what we saw, a massive development of the Beijing area. But there's two ways to look at the Olympics, I think, if we look at it from the Chinese perspective, from inside China. One is a tremendous amount of pride, well-deserved pride in your nation, in the fact that you are an international player, given Chinese history that every Chinese knows, everything from the Opium Wars, the end of the Qing dynasty, the warlord period in the 20s, Japanese invasion, Civil War, tremendous upheavals within the Maoist area, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and this meant China is now stable, international player, and it was really a proud moment. And I think that's can't be understated and very real. On the other hand, a lot of Chinese look at it as the investment and what kind of changes went through in Beijing, the restructuring of whole neighborhoods and whole sections of the city that got national attention and regional attention, really affected people about how much was it really worth the cost, what was it really doing for not just Beijing but for China beyond the international face. So I think there was kind of that dual aspect, which sounds like a contradiction, but in many things in China we tend to see a lot of contradictions.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that nationalistic pride part of this Olympic Games. I was doing college in Beijing when the 2008 Olympics game took place, and I remember a few years ahead of that, many of the stadiums were still under construction, and many of my friends wanted to go to just see the still under construction stadiums because they thought that represents a huge pride for China. And so I think that's a general sense among many Chinese about what this Olympic Games meant for them. Also, there was talk about the number of gold medals for the Chinese team during the 2008 Olympic Games should exceed Americans' number of gold medals because they thought the game was hosted in China, so they have this advantage of being the host. So maybe they should take this advantage to have more gold medals than America did. Of course, they didn't realize that, but that shows another aspect of this nationalist sense of pride.
Excellent. Well, we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll have a student come to you with a mic.
First of all, thank you for being here tonight, taking the time to be here. Second of all, my question is, what is the current Chinese public opinion on China's effort to increase its military capabilities, considering the implications on regional stability?
I don't think there's a lot of public opinion on that. Any public opinion poll probably wouldn't be allowed to ask about the military. But the general mood or general feeling of that, the military buildup is kind of a sense of a nationalist pride. And so if you're thinking about regional, most Chinese would look at the military buildup as something to protect territorial integrity. Territorial integrity is one of the key features of Chinese political legitimacy for the central leadership. And the military plays just one part of that. There is something I think I could tap on if you're thinking about public, would be the magazines I was talking about and the general magazine stores. There's always a section about military, not Chinese military buildup, but fascination with military tanks and things. Of course, there's always boys between 15 and 28 looking at all the magazines. But what features in them mostly are Chinese current weapon developments, American military, Russian military is huge. So there's always this fascination kind of with that development. TV programs talk about the Chinese military buildup in a sense of nationalist pride, that we need to be in the same sense of the Olympics, in that sense. The reality of the military spending and the buildup is comparatively still relatively small. Even Chinese military leaders say we are very far from Russia and especially the United States when it comes to military capacities and capability. China has one aircraft carrier that they said for years they were going to turn into a casino. And if anybody knows about an aircraft carrier, it's a used carrier they bought from Russia, basically built in the Ukraine, and the skill it takes to land a plane on a tiny platform in the middle of the ocean, the hours and hours it takes of practice, the amount of military it takes, capacity to actually run these, an aircraft carrier. China's far, far away from even utilizing the one aircraft carrier they have now. So the military, I think you made a very good point. Regional. There is one negative, the positive aspect of the military, public military buildup is nationalism. And it's building up a more confident China and the public in more confident. The negative side of it is it's actually raising the fears of South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam. Now, whether or not those fears are real or imagined, depending on the real difference between the military, may be a different issue. But the perception is that it is basically for regional stability and to maintain regional territorial integrity. Hopefully that got it.
And to add to the sort of media presence of this fascination with military stuff, for most of the major online news portal websites in China, if you look at Sina.com or 163.com, there's always section on military affairs on those news portal websites, and I think that shows how popular military affairs is among even Chinese internet users. And also for television news shows, this play into sort of the military and also nationalistic sentiments among the Chinese audiences. Those type of news shows are very popular among the Chinese audiences as well. And during my fieldwork in China, one of the producers, television news producers that I interviewed with, he actually was very dismissive of this sort of trying to play into the nationalistic sentiments among the audiences, because he saw that as being sort of negative to the regional stability, because if you're trying to instigate these nationalistic sentiments among the audiences, that might not be positive to the long-term regional stability. But I think that shows there is a market among the audiences regarding this military sort of fascination.
This one quick follow-up on that is that China, about 2 years ago, announced its stealth, or this attempt at a stealth bomber. Mm-hmm. And it didn't even get to its maiden flight, and they announced it. And there was pictures of it, and they saw it. Yeah. America had a stealth fighter for almost a decade, and nobody knew about it. That was because the audience for the stealth fighter at the time was for our overseas issues, overseas problems. You kept it a secret from the public. In China, what was the real audience for that? Was it international or was it domestic? Whenever it comes to military and military announcements and military developments, we always have to keep in mind on Chinese central government, who's their real audience? Just as Don was suggesting. Mm-hmm. Is it for the domestic or is it for the international?
We have a question up here.
As far as the media portrayal, or if there is any, of the Tibetan conflict, what is the public discourse like that in China?
I think for most ordinary Chinese, they don't really have a lot of knowledge on the sort of the true history, if you will, of Tibet. And in fact, for most ordinary Chinese, Tibet basically represents a tourist site that you can go to for Tibetan Buddhism, or a place that is not environmentally polluted yet. And in fact, there was an article in New York Times several days ago that describes how Chinese tourists, because they don't really, many of them lack necessary knowledge about Tibetan Buddhism, and so they would just go in a room where those Tibetan monks were studying, and they were disturbed because these tourists just suddenly bumped in. And so I think that shows what Tibet means for most ordinary Chinese. It is not necessarily political. It's really a tourist site that they can go.
That's a good question. I mean, within China, the discussion of Tibet, of course, is about Tibet as a part of China. Mm-hmm. There's been programs, documentaries, and it's in every history book. So the question of Tibet being anything but a part of China isn't discussed, and it is not debated, because within it there is no debate. For a Chinese, it would be like us debating Hawaii or Alaska. I'm just from the inside perspective. Having said that, I've had several Chinese friends who go to Tibet, and one of my best buddies, we went to Tibet. We do some work, not in Tibet, actually, let's back up for a minute. Initially, Tibet was 3 provinces, Yuzhang, Amdo, and Khan. So Yuzhang is what we see as a Tibetan autonomous region. But Amdo and Kan actually make up 5 other provinces of China, the majority in Qinghai province. So when you talk about, if somebody has a sticker or something that says free Tibetans, you have to think which ones. The ones in the Tibetan Autonomous Region or the ones in the other 5 provinces. So when we go into Tibetan regions in Qinghai, they don't speak Mandarin Chinese. And we went to one place and there was no running water, no electricity, and we went to visit with them, and we had a Tibetan colleague with us who translated for my Han Chinese friends and myself from Tibetan to Mandarin. And we're talking with them, and they said, we were asking the village leader, and we said, what is his current policies? What do you think about the education? We were talking about education policies. He knew everything. He was extremely knowledgeable about all the policies, everything that was going on. And my Chinese friend said, how do you know that if you don't have electricity and you don't speak Mandarin? And he looked at my friend and he said, you numbskull, I have a battery-operated radio, and it's Tibetan radio. I get Tibetan news translated from Mandarin to Tibetan on a battery-operated radio. I get all the information I need, and he knows what's going on. But what my friend said when we left struck me. He said, I felt like I was in a different country. It was, they served us tea, and it was, all the teacups were drawing on a pile of dung, and they were washing it with this old rag, and then they give us this milk tea. I took one sip to be polite, but, and my Chinese colleagues were the same way. It was completely alien to them. We've had similar experiences in Xinjiang in the West, where they speak Uyghur, and it's a completely different kind of cultural aspect. So the discourse or the discussion about Tibet in China is not about is Tibet a part of China? That's a given. There is no discussion about that, and that's part of the territorial integrity I was talking about. A ruler that does not rule China as a whole, including Spratly Islands, Taiwan, Tibet, cannot be legitimate in the eyes of Chinese rulers and within the populace. So that's how that kind of comes. But when you leave, you hear it. Or when I talk to Tibetans, they talk about it. So I've met Tibetans in China who talk about it and who discuss it. And they only do that after they find out I'm an American. Because I assume all Americans think about a free Tibet. So, but it was very interesting. And your discussion about Chinese walking into the Buddhist, it reminds me of Americans in the Middle East walking into a mosque.
We have a question up front here.
How is it determined whether Chinese students can study in American or British universities? And is that something that's encouraged by the government or heavily regulated? Or what is their opinion on it?
So your question is?
How do Chinese students come to study in the United States and the United Kingdom? And is it frowned upon or encouraged?
I'll do a quickly one. You got the best person right here. But it's a double-edged sword. So you have the biggest obstacle. It used to be the biggest obstacle in the 1990s. The biggest obstacle to go to America in the 1980s and 90s was China. China was the biggest obstacle. You had to go through your work unit to get a passport, to be able to get permission. It was very tough. Now the biggest obstacle is America. And that's kind of trying to go and trying to get to America. I was in China in May 1999 when America bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. And it was an accident, but all Chinese thought it was on purpose. There was a massive demonstration in front of the U.S. embassy, and they destroyed the U.S. embassy from the gates with rocks. And it was terrible. And they were all Chinese-age college students from Peking University and everything. They were throwing rocks and they were doing everything. The next day, there was a line around the block. The same students, they get a visa to go to America to study. It's no joke. It's no joke. So you have this dual thing where the government on one hand would kind of want to dissuade the brain drain, in a sense, but going to college in the US or the UK is actually seen as an important thing. I mean, the KU, I'll just say this one more thing and then I want you to go. When I first came to KU, we had less than 100 Chinese students who came to KU. This is 2003. Less than 100. Most were graduate students. Now we got close to 900, mostly undergraduate. And that's kind of a fascinating and a huge increase. Every university in America is dealing with this huge influx of Chinese undergraduates, which has no precedent. We haven't seen that before.
Yeah, speaking to a question, on the government side, there isn't really any restriction in terms of whether you can attend foreign universities, American or British. I think, as Professor said, now the biggest obstacle is on the American side, whether they can pass the English test, whether they can submit an application that's good enough to get them into the university. And also another issue here is the family income. So generally, these are the families that can afford their kids to go to an American university or British university, as well as the living expense there. And so that also speaks to this divide in terms of income, whether you can afford your kids a foreign education. So that's another big issue, money here.
Yeah, and what's really kind of fascinating too is you have in every major city, they have these services to help you apply to an American or British university. And so this is big business now coming up to apply to do that. And then you have a new phenomenon that students are not even preparing for the Chinese college entrance exam. They're preparing for ACT and SATs to do that. And you have different types of undergraduates here. You have some that did very well on their college entrance exam, but their parents want them to come here to study. You have some that didn't do very well on the college entrance exam, but they have money and they come here to study. You have, in most major Chinese universities, and I found this fascinating, and I found this more and more common, university professors at the highest universities in China, almost all their kids are going to university in America. In last June, I was at a dinner with some mid-level urban, about the size of Kansas City, the mayor and party secretary. And we're having dinner and we're talking. Of course, one of their kids is in America studying. And they asked me the big question that I usually get from higher officials: do you think there'll be a war between the US and China? And I said, definitely not. And they said, why? I said, because all the major leaders have their kids in America going to school. which in many cases is relatively true. But that's a very good question. But the government does not restrict. The Chinese government doesn't restrict. The biggest restriction now is Chandan aptly put, was the American side and the income and finances.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hello. Yeah, first of all, thanks for the great speech. And unfortunately, I'm one of the 900 Chinese students. And
Fortunate.
Yeah, fortunately.
fortunately, I'm a graduate student, not undergraduate student. And since today's topic is about media and politics, and I want to ask you a question about the hot issue happened these days, several days before. It's a live show called Jimmy Kimmel Show, and he say what happened that day is like he asking some kids, and the American owes China $1.3 trillion and ask them how to pay them back. And one of the kids just say, "Oh, kill all the Chinese, and then you don't have to pay us back." And that really pissed Chinese off, I think. And we wrote an angry letter to Jimmy Kimmel Show and ABC, right? And I don't think they just take it seriously. And right now we just try to protest in front of the ABC headquarters, I think. So what do you think about this issue? And do you know what's the big difference between the American media and the Chinese media? That's my question. Thank you.
I think, first of all, that shows how closely Chinese audiences follow American shows. Because you mentioned Chinese late-night shows probably are only popular among Chinese audiences, but Chinese were able to pick up, any lines from those late-night shows. So I think that shows how closely tied some of the Chinese who obviously can understand English and are interested in this, how closely they follow American shows. So I think that first and foremost shows the close ties between Chinese audiences and American shows. And secondly, that reminds me of another event which happened around the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which is the anti-CNN event, because some Chinese, they weren't satisfied with the way CNN was covering the protests that happened during the sort of the torch rally around the world. There were free Tibetan signs or free Xinjiang signs or human rights issues. So the protest that was against the Chinese government. And so they launched this anti-CNN website where they try to publish their own versions of the events. So I think that speaks to this broader phenomenon of the rise of nationalism in China right now.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's the Jimmy Kimmel thing I'm not completely familiar with, but the idea of somebody saying something stupid on American TV doesn't completely surprise me. And sometimes you have people who pick up on things like that who already have a nationalist or anti-American feeling, or the opposite. I've heard things from Chinese generals that would slip out something about we should nuke America, or there's a problem here with Americans doing something really terrible to China, and then some knucklehead on the U.S. side picks it up and says, look what they're saying about us. I think we need to be very careful about letting any one or two really bad remarks from people who really don't have any influence take charge of the relationship and the type of discussion we have and debate we have between China and the U.S. I don't even think Kimmel deserves, and that whole comment deserves that much attention. I think that's exactly what they want, right? They say it to get attention, and they play it up to get attention. So it's a terrible comment. But again, if a Chinese nationalist wanted to scour the American AM radio waves and the pundits and the people that are going through, they'll be able to pick out at least 3 or 4 of those a day. And it's unfortunate, but I think that's why venues like this, I think students and people coming to these things, putting things like this on, trying to reduce and eliminate some of that. I've noticed ever since the 1990s, I've been on planes and people asking me, what do you do? And I said, I do stuff in China. In the 1990s, people were just saying, aren't you scared? Is it terrible what's going on there? Are you really, is it okay? And now it's when I first started learning Chinese in 1990, everybody thought I was nuts. I had a girlfriend leave me, my folks wouldn't talk to me for a while. Everybody thought I was out of my mind. What are you wasting your time in China, in college doing this? Now everybody says, oh, you're so smart. It was so smart. What a great choice. So I've seen American attitudes in general, I mean, kind of despite this terrible remark, has become more open and a general understanding. And I think this baseline, this discussion, and these openness, and here on both sides of the Pacific, I think really do help contribute to a better relationship. And just the fact that you're one of the 900 also contributes very well to that development.
All right, well, we have time for 2 final questions. So.
Well, with such a large movement towards cultural Americanization within China, what kind of consideration is given towards cultural diversity, such as the Uyghur culture in the west part of China and Tibetan culture? Just like, how does the media or education system deal with this kind of diversity within China right now?
Sure. Yeah. As far as I know, I don't think there are any official sort of large efforts to push for this diversity inside China. And I think for most ordinary Chinese, they make their choice in terms of the cultural products or where to go to school based on the considerations of better future for themselves, no matter it's employment or where they live. So that's a very practical kind of consideration. And that may not necessarily be good for this diversity, as you mentioned it. But I think that's the general situation in China.
Yeah, and I would build on that. That's a very good question. And what's really fascinating about this is there's whole classes on this, and there's a tremendous amount of literature on exactly what you're talking about. And according to official Chinese, there's 56 nationalities and 55 official minorities. America and very few democracies have a clear number of exactly how many minorities. So China has official minorities, and so they claim that there is diversity, and that the diversity really is in the types of nationalities that they have. Most of the posters and government posters and other posters and television programs will have pictures of Uyghurs and Tibetans and the Zhang minority, the Hui, and all these kind of different minorities. So they say these official 55 national minorities. Now they make up 8% of the Chinese population. But those 8% are all along the border areas, mostly. So they really work hard at trying to integrate ideologically the diversity of China, to say this is part of China, this is what we are. On the other hand, We do see education and other systems that, on the one hand, we see policies that have actually been discriminatory policies towards certain groups. Particularly, we've seen in religious groups about restricting the type of the age to become a monk, going into the monastery, whether you have nuns and also mosques in Islam. Mosques exist. The government pays for mosques. The government builds mosques in churches, but they also have restrictions on that. On the other hand, they have affirmative action for certain groups on getting into college, getting into jobs, certain types of affirmative action to help integrate some of the government offices. In Tibet, about 90% of local government officials are Tibetan. As you get higher up, you see fewer and fewer Tibetans. But that would show the contradiction, that they are getting involved in some hands and others are not. But there is this national government, there's national minority parks, national minority days, certain things that they get to try to show that they're trying to integrate. So we do see a real effort. And my running joke in China is when I see somebody who wants to ask me where I'm from, and I can see they got this anti-American feel to them, they say, what country are you from? I say, I'm Chinese. And they say, you can't be Chinese. I say, yes, I am. I'm the 57th nationality. and see, the whole point of this joke is everybody in China knows there's 56 nationalities. How many people in America knows exactly how many nationalities we have? So that kind of gets you that sense of, so from a Chinese perspective, we're more diverse. We know all of our nationalities. But I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here so you can see that. But there's the government use of the minorities and how they portray them is fascinating, and there's a tremendous amount of literature on that. So you really keyed in on something very interesting and important.
Well, we have time for one final question.
Hi, sir. Based on your expressed expertise in rural politics, I was curious if you could shed some light on kind of why the rural is so far behind compared to the urban. And I've heard, or I understand that like rural farmers are kind of tied to their land; they can't sell it, and then use that money to buy a place in the city. So rural in the city is kind of like a no man's sort of category. So if you could shed some light on that and perhaps what you see changing, or if you think the new government is going to work towards that, towards, I guess, liberalizing the policy in the rural areas, I would appreciate it.
That's an excellent question. Thank you for the comment, but I wouldn't say expert. If anybody tells you they're a Chinese expert and they completely understand China, don't believe them. I haven't met a Chinese leader, high leader, that tells me he fully understands China. But having said that, that's a very good question. Try to make it a quick kind of brief. The rural and urban gap was institutionalized. It was always a big gap. And in 1950, you had about 90% or close to 80, 88% of the population that lived in the countryside. Right now, you've got 49%. So we've seen this huge urbanization over time. But throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, the Chinese government practiced something called, by economics, they call them policy scissors. And what happened is they used the countryside and the grain and had the farmers stay on the countryside. It was illegal to move to the city. You could not move to the city. You had to stay on the farms, produce grain, to sell it for a quota and a lower than market cost in order to pay for urban industrialization. Those price scissors kept that rural and urban gap as an institutional mechanism that kept that gap large all the way up into the early 1990s. As those price caps changed and the markets opened, and then they also allowed for rural to urban migration to occur, we tended to see higher incomes in the rural areas and greater opportunities. But those opportunities have come at a cost when you talk about rural to urban migration, moving a lot. You said you had keyed on this very good point. Nobody owns land in China. Nobody owns it. It's either communally owned in the countryside or state owned in the city. You lease the land. So farmers lease the land. So when they go to the countryside, when they go to the cities, they can always go back to the land. Now, one take on this, which you made a very good point, is they can't sell the land to go to the cities to use that as capital to develop or buy a home or to do something like that. That makes good sense. On the other hand, villagers could always go back to the countryside when there's low employment in the city, or there's a problem, they can go back for that. What China doesn't have, their major cities, that most developing countries have, are massive slums. You don't see the favelas that you see outside of Rio de Janeiro, or the massive slums outside of Mexico City, or Ankara, Turkey, or Cairo. Why? Or Mumbai. The reason why we don't see that is because in those other countries, farmers sell their land, they go to the cities, and if they can't find good jobs in the cities, they will homestead or get the cheapest areas outside of the cities because they can't return to the countryside. They've sold their land. So now that limbo is actually literally right on the edge of the city. But in China, they can't sell their land. And they usually typically go back. And there's always somebody there farming it. They used to call it the feminization of agriculture. The men go to the cities and the women stay behind and argue. Now we call it kind of the generational. There's older folks are farming. And the younger ones are going out to the cities. And now we see the cities expanding and absorbing that countryside. So in some cases that's happening by choice, some not by choice, and some by just dragging, kicking, and screaming and protesting. We see a combination of all of that. So the rapid change in the countryside has been, number one, the quality of life has improved. I see people, the best lesson I ever got in China was I was there, I've been there for over 2 years, I'm living in a village, I've been in this village for about a month, and I'm carrying water, and everybody carries water. And we're carrying water from a pump in the middle of the village, and we carry it back. And it's hard work, and I'm putting it down, and I said, I'm talking to that older gentleman who lives next door, and he was carrying water, and I said, this is a really tough life. And he got about 2 inches from my nose. He said, "Pay, show都不知道." He said, and he's basically implies that you don't know anything. Nobody starved in this village in the last 20 years. My granddaughter's going to junior high school. We've got electricity. I got a TV in my house. What the hell do you know? We are really doing really well. And I learned a lot. The guy didn't finish from elementary school, and I learned a tremendous amount from that experience, which is I don't compare what I see, what I have with what they have. I don't compare what I think is tough to what they think is tough. I compare what was going on there between 5 or 10 years ago. Most villagers will tell you their lives have improved. Given that, they do understand the gap is getting larger. And one interesting thing you brought up too is that in the past, they knew they were poor, but they couldn't compare. Now you got TVs. They go to the cities, they see the good life, and they come back. And now that gap has become more apparent. So that has been a problem. And we've seen a rise in protests in the rural areas over the last 20 years. Some people say that those protests are a negative sign, that things may be spinning out of control. Other people say that the protests reflect the government allowing more steam to come out. Those who don't have the internet and doing Weibo are actually going out and protesting, and that it's usually against local government, not the central government. And another take on it is that protests might have been higher in the past, but they weren't allowed to report them. So now we might actually have lower number of protests, but greater number of journalists that have more freedom to report on them than we've seen in the past. But the rural development, I think you asked a great question, and I didn't have enough time to really do it justice, but that's a very good point. And that's my passion right now, is still looking at rural development is something that's why I go back every year.
Yeah, just add to that very briefly. One of the great documentaries that we discussed in class is The Last Train Home. So adding to the large-scale rural to urban migration, there have been a number of social problems created by that. And one of them is this left-home children, because their young parents have to go to the cities for work and to make more money. And because of the household registration system in China, their children cannot get into schools in the city, or they have to pay a higher fee to get into the schools. So many of the children have to be left behind in the rural villages. And the problem with that is those children don't get to see their parents. And many of them could only see their parents once a year during the Spring Festival period. And so many children, so in the documentary, those children were actually they didn't understand why their parents left them to go to the cities. Of course, their parents went to the cities to make money for better education for the kids, but the kids couldn't really understand that. And so they were sort of blame the parents for leaving them behind. And so that kind of rural to urban migration is also creating problems that has real implications on people's families and lives.
Yeah, just one quick note on that is, part of our research, and one thing we did about 5 years ago, we tried to put together a PTA, Parent Teachers Association. And we were doing this relatively new idea, and we were doing it in these villages. And we were finding that 80%, 70% were all the grandparents. And I said, we need to change it to the GTA, the Grandparent Teachers Association, because it was, and it was struck me as to see that how many of the elderly folks were really had to take care of their kids. And they thought about it as that's just part of what they do. And then the other thing is they're combining elementary schools. One of the most, I think, negative aspects of rural-urban divide, and I'll make this the last point, is something that our research center has been working a lot on, and is throughout rural China. They've been combining Hebing, Hebing Xiaoshui, combining the elementary schools. So it used to be every village had an elementary school. But because of the success of family planning, fewer kids, and also a tax reform, they have combined 10 villages into one elementary school. Now you've got 7, 8-year-old kids living in dorms. And they're staying in dorms until the 6th grade. That has created a whole new slew of issues that now that the rural areas have to try to face, including who's at home and working with them, which is a fantastic point. My esteemed colleague brought up.
Well, I think we could, or at least I could listen to this conversation all night, but we should probably end it here. I want to thank you all for coming. If you'll join me and give it a warm round of applause. And make sure you look at the back of the programs and see all of the upcoming programs. And thank you for coming, and have a good night.